John Yearwood and I sat down for a lively conversation about the First Amendment, executive powers, and education. As a veteran educator, John has some insight into what problems exist in U.S. schools and how they can be dealt with. We also discussed his new book, Jar of Pennies, and how it was modeled after a real murder in East Texas. Now, please meet John Yearwood. Hello and welcome to the Yarsnick Show. Today I have with me John Yearwood. How are you, sir?
I'm fine, Robert. It's good to be here. I enjoy getting to know you and being on your show.
Yeah. So you've lived here in Austin, which is kind of an easy commute down here.
No, there's no easy commute in Austin. There used to be. I can remember when the town only had 130,000 people in it.
Yeah, wow. And how long have you been here?
Well, most recently 11 years, but I came in 1970. So,
oh, okay. All right.
It was kind of a small place.
Oh, wow. Do you wish you just had bought up half the city back then?
Well, I did, but buy a house. I did buy a house.
Yeah.
And it turned out to be a half a block from the UT president's house. Mm. I bought it for $27, sold it 3 years later for $167, and thought I'd made a killing.
Yeah.
It was on the market yesterday for $1.8 million. I missed a killing on that score, but on the other hand, that was 50 years ago. So,
yeah. Wow, geez. I keep looking at these little real estate buys. I'm like, oh, I know that's going to go up eventually. Like, well,
don't you? Yeah, right.
So we're here to talk about your book, Jar of Pennies, but I wanted to talk a little bit about your background first, kind of how you got here, and kind of get the audience a little more familiar with you. So you actually were a journalist at one point.
I was.
For like 15 years,
That's
the
correct.
way I understand that.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I read is that you focus pretty heavily on the First Amendment.
I did, yes.
Which happens to be one of my favorite amendments.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely one of the top two.
If you're in this business, yeah.
Exactly. There's no way I would be able to do this job if I weren't a very strong advocate for people saying what they need to say to get the media, get the message out or whatever. Right. So can you tell us a little bit about that you said you did some papers, some academic papers around the First Amendment. What was that about?
Well, the First Amendment has three basic freedoms in it. One of them is press, one of them is religion, and one of them is assembly, right? The right to assemble. And attached to the right to the assemble is a right to petition the government for redress of grievance. A lot of people get all that mixed up. Do you remember a couple of years ago, some people in Congress were talking about there's no separation of church and state mentioned in the Constitution? Well, it's in the First Amendment. That's where that is. Congress will not make a law affecting an establishment of religion. That separates church from the government. So people misunderstand the First Amendment a lot. Obviously, press freedom is a big deal for us. Mm-hmm. And even though frequently in the history of this country, there's been a lot of antagonism between the press and elected officials. Even Thomas Jefferson complained about it. Mm-hmm. He complained about people publishing something he called false facts.
Sounds familiar.
Lies that were presented as facts. Well, we have that today, don't we?
Yes, we sure do.
So that is a wrinkle in democracy that's never gone away. On the other hand, because it's there, it throws the power of the government back on the people. The main purpose of the First Amendment is to keep the people informed of what their elected officials are doing. Elected officials are spending their money. The people ought to know what they're doing with it. And everybody ought to be able to express their opinion about it, but the opinions have to aggregate statewide, nationwide, in order for there to be any movement in the government. So I think that without the First Amendment, you don't have democracy. Period. You just don't have democracy. You don't have government by the people because people don't know anything.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I like about it is it's the great marketplace of ideas. If you have 500 bad ideas and one good idea, people will notice. they'll say that one idea seems really good, and all these other ones seem terrible. So why don't we just do this one?
Yeah.
But if you can't, if you just have one lawmaker deciding what everyone hears,
right,
it's a roll of the dice whether you get good information out.
Right, and the best ideas you hope are the ones that float to the surface.
And I've seen a lot of bad ideas come from the government, especially in my industry, computer security industry.
Well, you know what the old saying is, I don't tell jokes, I just watch the government and report the facts.
I like that.
Yeah.
No, I've not heard that. That's a good joke.
Yeah,
I'm a big fan of it. I think not just because of this show, but I think it might be part of why I started the show. Thinking back, there was a myriad of reasons I wanted to do it, but one of them is I felt like the people around me have such interesting stories. I felt like they didn't have a voice to get it out. They didn't feel comfortable getting it out. And I wanted them to know it's not just possible to get it out, but I want to encourage them. I want to get their voices heard because they have interesting ideas.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not just the platform. I think, honestly, people just forgotten that they have this right that they can use at any time. You can go say whatever you want, anywhere you want, approximately. And I noticed that people were sort of self-censoring, and I did not like that. It made me feel like, because to your point, I think that gets rid of democracy. And so I really like the idea of authors, of, people with just clever ideas or whatever, having a voice and being able to get out there.
And a free flow of ideas. That's really important.
Yeah.
You can't have any kind of progress if people can't argue.
Yep. Agreed.
And sometimes the arguments are just balance one another out, and you come to a position of stasis where you can't decide which one is better. But if you maintain that position long enough, sooner or later, something will begin to emerge that is better than either one of those ideas. And it's a combination of the principles behind each one. I think that's the term for that is cognitive dissonance, when you have opposing ideas and you can't figure out how to make them work.
Well, and oftentimes technology marches on and we finally have a solution.
Right.
It wasn't possible before, and now we have this new thing.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And that's a beautiful thing for me. It's like we were all just deadlocked for so long, and finally this technology just unlocked a new potential.
Right. And I mean, can you imagine what would have happened in this country 20 years ago if we'd had the COVID pandemic without the mRNA vaccine technology that we've been able to come up with? We lost 1 million Americans anyway. But can you imagine how much worse that pandemic would have been without this new technology? And that just speaks to your point. Technology advances, and it usually advances for the benefit of mankind.
Usually.
and then there are nuclear weapons.
Well, that's for another time. I'll get a nuclear scientist on here at some point.
Or Kurt Vonnegut's Ice 9.
Yeah.
Right? You remember that? Yeah,
I do, actually. That's an interesting book.
Yep.
For one of the very few books I've actually read, because I cannot read very well. I'm super... not dyslexic isn't even the right word for it. I've got something else. Right. It just takes me like weeks to read a book.
Yeah.
So the other thing you did research on, which I thought was interesting and worth talking about, was the extrajudicial capabilities that are delivered to the president, some capabilities beyond what Congress would normally say that someone would be able to do as a lawmaker or whatever.
I call that the crisis paradigm, and it's what happens when the nation enters a crisis it's not prepared for, but it is not prepared for, or that the Constitution doesn't already address.
So it's usually crisis driven, is what you're saying.
It's crisis driven.
Interesting.
And so I compared George W. Bush and the attack on the World Trade Center and his response to that with Abraham Lincoln's actions during the Civil War. And in both cases, things like writ of habeas corpus were suspended.
Can you explain that just for the audience? I think that's worth...
What a writ of habeas corpus is?
Yeah.
Yeah, a writ of habeas corpus, the words are Latin, and they literally mean to have the body. Habeas, to have, corpus, the body. And it means that you can't put somebody in prison and just keep them there indefinitely. which we have, of course, done at Guantanamo. But Abraham Lincoln did that with some of the Confederate soldiers that the Union captured, and Confederate soldiers were doing that with some of the Union soldiers.
And some people think that's one of the biggest failings of Abraham Lincoln, is that he did that, and he shouldn't have. But there's a lot of good that could have come from not delivering soldiers back to the enemy.
Right, and it was a way to expedite the end of the war, which needed to be ended. I'm not sure that putting 60 people in Guantanamo and then torturing them day and night and getting no benefit from doing that was actually a good thing, but that's not my decision to make.
Yeah. So my understanding about Abraham Lincoln's case is many of the states found it to be unconstitutional, and therefore they wouldn't follow it, or then it was sort of turned back on, and then they continued to do it even after it was turned back on. So it was maybe that's a failure of mass media and communication and a clear line of sight of who was in charge of what. But it seemed like there was a lot of confusion or disagreement about it even at the time, like outside of the academia, like individuals who were actually in charge of doing it, they couldn't even decide what was the right answer or not.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and in the crisis, you do basically what you have to do. And I think those were the decisions that Abraham Lincoln was making. I think he was sleepless many nights, worrying about those. He seemed to be, to me anyway, looking back on his administration, he seemed to be a very conscientious and intelligent person, and I think he paid a lot of attention to these decisions. I think he was a very moral person. I'm not sure anybody would disagree with that assessment. And you can't do things like that are obviously outside the powers given to you by the Constitution without worrying about what you're doing. If you're the kind of person Abraham Lincoln was. If you're not that kind of person, then you can get away with all kinds of stuff.
I mean, the fear typically for a president is you're going to go to jail, or your population is going to come and hang you. But I think because he was in the middle of a war, half the population was so fervently on his side that the chances of that happening were very, very thin, I think. His detractors were well muted by the fact we were in a war.
Right, and the Union had not been very successful early on. So it wasn't until those first disasters began to percolate through the population that the rest of the people in the North began to say, "Oh, wait a minute, if we don't do something about this, it's going to be bad news." And meanwhile, in the South, people are just trying to defend their homesteads. There's an economic system that supports them and their communities, and they want to keep that economic system. Unfortunately, it's an economic system based on slavery. Morally, it's repugnant, but we still see slave states in the world today.
Yes, we do.
Some of whom we are in direct competition with, and
some of whom we get our iPhones from.
Absolutely, yeah, right. I was heading south today on Mopac. I know you were too, and I got to that choke point there where Mopac turns off and a lane goes down and turns under and comes up on Cesar Chavez and 5th Street. and Mopac has been, it's been cooking along at 3 solid lanes, and then suddenly it chokes down to 2 lanes. So and the traffic just backs up for a couple of miles every afternoon.
Yep.
It just creeps. And if there's a flat tire or a breakdown or a fender bender, and then nobody gets home that night. And I was thinking, we've got $45 billion or $35 billion surplus in the state budget. Austin is going to pay $90 million to the airport to buy them out of a operating contract out there. I wonder what if we weren't spending that money on the airport, or if we could get some money from the state, could we extend the toll lane in both directions.
Past that point, yeah.
Past that point and over the river, and use open the toll lane up so you don't have that 2-lane choke point there. How much would that cost? And I started trying to calculate that in my mind, and I realized I remember a story from when China hosted the Olympics, and 3 weeks before the Olympics were hosted, there was not a superhighway from downtown out to the stadium. And they started working, and within 3 weeks they had a superhighway built. It was 8 lanes in both directions and freshly concreted, and they did that in 3 weeks. If you have a slave economy where everybody works for the government and gets what they're going to get, depending on whether or not they show up for work that day, you can do things like that.
So it sounds like you're saying slavery is a great idea.
What I'm saying is that
I'm obviously kidding.
I know from a capitalist point of view, it's not so bad, because it simplifies your labor costs, and it made the fabulous wealth of the South what it was, and you can go anywhere, up River Road along the Mississippi River and see remnants of those plantations. You can go to Natchez, Mississippi, and see some of the most beautiful,
very beautiful,
beautiful homes, but they were built with slave labor, and they would not have been built if it hadn't been for the slaves not having to be paid a wage.
Yeah.
So I'm not arguing in favor of slavery by any means, but I am saying what I am saying is, we started off talking about Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War, and what I was saying is, the people in the South are trying to defend an economic system that was morally repugnant, but very successful for them. And the result of their dependence upon that one form of economy meant that they were unable to move away from it. They were making so much money doing that they couldn't find new ways to make money for themselves. So when the war came and the slaves were freed and they didn't have that source of labor anymore, the whole territory plunged into poverty. It's still in poverty. 100 and something years later, 150 years later.
Yeah. Well, 60. I think we're going to get back to that in reference to your book, actually. Yeah. So let's put a pin in that one. We'll come back. The other one was the Japanese internment during World War II. That was another one of those very specific wartime things that the president just decided one day, I'm going to put anyone in jail who happens to come from another country,
right, for
years, potentially.
Right, and take away their property. And they were American citizens, and they were, born in America. They were,
Yeah, a lot of them were actually born here, too.
Yeah, a lot of them were born here.
Yeah.
They had relatives in Japan, but they did the same thing with some of the German citizens that were here. And it was pretty dicey to live in a place like New Braunfels or Bernie when either of the world wars came along, because there were German citizens who were still speaking German down there, and some of them still do, and they were looked upon with suspicion.
Understandably,
yeah.
So these extra powers were given at a time when the general public was allowed to look the other way. They were given sort of permission to say, this is just wartime.
Yes.
And that, I think that's a really, really slippery slope.
No fooling. When does the crisis end?
Right.
Who makes that decision?
Right.
And if you control the media, then the people never get a chance to make that decision, and you never get that freedom back. Mm-hmm. That gets back to our earlier point about the First Amendment. That's the purpose of the First Amendment, is to protect the freedoms of the people from being taken by a government, which may be at any one particular moment encouraged to do what George W. Bush did, launch a war. Just gather up anybody that looked Arab and put them in jail, waterboard them. And on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have people from the FBI going on national television saying, we really need some Farsi speaking people. Is there anybody in the United States who speaks Farsi that would like to come work with us on this? Do you remember saying that?
I was a bit young at the time.
Of course, this is before your time.
Not before my time, but,
I'm sorry.
but
I'm
I was
sorry.
I was a bit young, so I don't remember that in detail.
Yeah.
But I do remember a number of other things kind of similar. So there was this the Presidential Emergency Action Documents, PEADS. There was I don't know. I don't think anyone knows, other than maybe somebody in the government, what the actual number of these documents are. But there's potentially hundreds of these sort of secret laws that we have on the books.
Yeah, there are.
And we don't really even have a strong idea of what they are, let alone like the specific details and how to interpret them.
Right.
It seems odd to me. This is one of the things. One of my buddies always said, well, if you ever want to know that the government or anyone who works in the government doesn't really know what they're doing, just ask them how many laws there are. How many? Like, give me a number. And this is the reason why that would be impossible. You'd have to disclose things that would actually be impossible to show to the public.
Classified documents committing the United States to go to war against certain sorts of behaviors. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, there are emergency declarations that are in effect since Richard Nixon. A lot of them having to do with fuel efficiency and in response to the Arab oil crisis of, when was that? 1962. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
No.
I think that's right.
No, I think
70s.
It was a little later, 1970.
Yeah.
Not 1972.
Yep.
Yeah, 1972.
Remember the long lines, and I think that was color TV did exist at that time.
Yes,
that's kind of my demarcation point.
Yeah. Before that is really ancient history. I understand. Yeah.
Well, I can just remember visually if it's all like monochromatic, but it's kind of yellowish monochromatic.
Right. Yes, right.
That's the 70s.
Well, and my brain is one of those. It stores images. And one of my images is of the price on a gas pump at a Esso station before it changed its name to Exxon on 24th Street. And it was 37.9 cents a gallon for gas in 1971 or 72. And then, bam, it went to $1 a gallon. And it's never gone down.
It's not going back down.
And it's not going back down.
No, it is not.
And in some ways, that's a measure of inflation or the devaluation of the dollar. But in other ways, it's a measure of how the economy has grown in demand. Mm-hmm. It could still be sold for that, but
there's also a lot of tax added to gas. So some of that's, I'm not sure exactly what the percentage is, but so back to this PEADS thing. Apparently the church committee after Watergate was the first one to kind of open the books that this thing even existed and what its scope was. And I don't think they published the specifics, but they were able to kind of allude to what might be in some of them. Seize property and commodities, seize control of transport, communications, organize and control the means of production, assign military forces abroad, and restrict travel.
Yeah, nationally.
That is
inside the borders of the United States.
That is basically every power you'd want.
Right. In direct contravention of the Constitution, which says you can't do that. You can't restrict travel between states, and yet
you can.
Yet, guess what? The feds can do that.
They sure can.
And then the question is, do we want that power taken away from the feds? Or do we just want it regulated by a vote of the people? If people were really upset about that, it would disappear.
I don't think anyone knows it's, other than a handful of people like you and I who dig in a little bit.
Right.
I don't think people know that.
Well, and by and large, it doesn't exist by and large. Mm-hmm. The federal government's not out there manning the borders of Texas saying you can't come and go. They're not doing that. Although they have the right to do it under that act.
I think this is how Trump was able to block certain countries from flying in as well, using this same set of laws that we can't see.
Right. And then declaring a national health emergency, which gave him other rights. I mean, when he made that declaration, he wrote into that declaration certain powers that he was going to be authorized to take, which included isolating people offshore. So he did.
So where does that leave us? What do you think should happen?
I'd love to have a country by the people and for the people. I think Congress is the place where those decisions need to be made, but I don't think they can be made by an uninformed or ignorant population. I think in my lifetime, certainly in the last 20 years, we've seen a dramatic decrease in the effectiveness of public education. I think we've seen a growing dependence upon randomized tests of trivia of students to see if they have acquired the proper amount of knowledge to graduate from one grade to another.
As far as I can tell, the answer is a hard no.
And right. Yeah. I mean, in my opinion, it doesn't reach to the point where. Let me back that phrase out.
Sure.
From my point of view, the general failure of public education is that the focus has shifted from critical thinking skills to memorization and discipline. Mm-hmm. Well, kids are not naturally disciplined, so there does need to be an adult in the room. Mm-hmm. But critical thinking, it never gets really. It's written into the curriculum. Now, don't get me wrong. Mm-hmm. It's written into the curriculum, but the curriculum says you will take this memorized fact and compare it with this memorized fact, and using your critical thinking skills, you will write a paragraph saying that you have done so and so and so and so, and that such and such and such is the result. Okay, that's a start on critical thinking, but it takes away from the student's agency of expressing and discussing with one another their ideas and testing their ideas against those of other people, and carrying on a lively discussion or of some kind of interesting fact that that leads them to a higher level of comprehension. And the wonderful thing about teaching, and I wish I could encourage more people to be teachers. The wonderful thing about teaching is to watch the daily progress of kids' brains. It's amazing. Mm-hmm. They go home at 3 p.m. on one day, having gone through your class, and they come in the next day. It's as though they've made a quantum leap in their ability to think. Mm-hmm. Their abilities increase geometrically if you have been engaging them. Kids engage by play, and learning needs to be a game. It needs to be fun. It needs to be something you do because it's fun, mm-hmm. not because you're being browbeat or whipped into some standing in a straight line and keeping your shirt tail tucked in. My God, who cares?
So my understanding is some of this came from the No Child Left Behind Act. Is that when you noticed that started happening, or has this been when you got started? Because you've been in education for a long time.
I've been in education for a long time. I've had a career of over 50 years mm-hmm. in education, and I noticed that George W. Bush was a really fine governor for the state of Texas, but he was also the governor who started the testing regimen for students on the theory that you could test student knowledge level and determine whether or not the schools were actually teaching kids anything. Now, I don't know why they thought schools were not teaching kids anything, because if you look at the result of now over 20 years, almost 25 years of that kind of testing regimen, you discover that people by and large are a lot more ignorant. Mm-hmm. than they used to be. And it's
especially about things like American history.
American history and and
strange.
Yeah. And people will go on and say things. I mean, they'll come out and they'll stand up on stage and they'll say, I'm an American. I can do anything I want. Well, yeah, they can. You can do anything you want in America. You just can't choose the consequences of your behavior, right? Well, if you don't have the critical thinking skill to reason ahead from what you do to what is likely to be a consequence of that behavior, you're just ignorant.
I think that describes most people I meet. Yeah. Very ignorant.
Well, and you drove on Mopac today too,
Yes,
didn't
sir.
you? Yeah. Mm-hmm. The largest collection of idiots in the world outside of Congress are on the highway.
Yeah, I try to avoid it when I can, but unfortunately, there's no other way to get here. Not expeditiously.
Oh, and I was the other thing I was daydreaming about was, where's my flying car? You remember when we were growing up, where the Jetsons had those flying cars?
Yeah,
Can you see teenagers in flying cars?
They can. They keep promising us any year now. I think Popular Mechanics every single year says the flying car is almost here. It's been wrong every year for the last 50 years.
And the way people drive, can you see them in the air? My gosh.
Oh, they have to be all computers.
Yeah.
Actually, to your point about driving, though, I gotta say this. There's this meme out there that's it's just I think it's a picture of the 405 or somewhere in LA or something, and there's 10 or 15 lanes on one side, 10 or 15 lanes on the other side, and it's and the meme's just like, come on, man, just one more lane, bro. Give me one more lane. All I need is one more lane, bro. I'm like, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Very good point. So if you were to say what the problem is, if there's something that could be done, well, okay, to your point about COVID, the children pre and post COVID have lost a huge amount. They've backslid tremendously.
Yes, they have.
And I just imagine being a kid and having a social life and having friends and whatever, and suddenly one day you're just stuck at home with your boring or annoying parents for 24 hours a day for the next year. And there's nothing about that that's fun. I don't care. I mean, the parents can try, but it's just not gonna be the same as their friends.
Right.
And so even if the kids don't really care about school exactly, what they do care about is, the interacting with the people around them and, just having things to do and talk about and whatever, and study groups and the kind of things that go along with school. Mm-hmm. And they're kind of accidentally learning if for no other reason, right? Even if they kind of anti-school, they're sort of accidentally learning through osmosis. I think that was probably the best example of why you're right about that. Because if kids aren't having fun, they aren't learning.
They aren't learning. They're not learning.
So how do we make that more fun? Like what's the process?
Obviously, I'm not the kind of genius that comes up with a solution to that problem, and I hope we have somebody in this country.
Come on now, I'm sure you have ideas.
But I have some ideas. But as we were saying earlier, you have to throw those ideas out there and let them get in conflict with other ideas, and we'll see if something doesn't emerge that makes a better overall solution. About 100 years ago, we in this country, we started looking at education, and we decided that we would employ the mass assembly line principle in education. Well, that had never happened before. So we divided up education by subject matter, and then we assigned teachers to do subject matter, and then we moved the students along as though they're on an assembly line, running them through, and then you get to the end of the century, and people are saying, well, let's test our students and see if they're actually developing any skills, and then everybody doubles down on the assembly line process, and there you go. Well, when you remove kids from their humanity, which is what that does, you remove them from the learning process. I'm not sure those kids actually didn't learn. They just didn't learn stuff that you could measure. Well, not you individual, but that. Yeah.
Well, me too.
Yeah. Well, you too. Yeah. They didn't learn. They didn't learn 19th century political theory, right? Which they could have if they'd been interested in it. And there were some who were individually interested in it and did their own reading, right? There were some. There were.
Of course.
It's a big country.
Yes. Some people, that's all they can do is read the books about that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they're not interested in doing anything else.
Right.
There are people like that.
Yeah, of course.
Well, but if you have an assembly line process, thank you, Henry Ford. If you have an assembly line process, then you're trying to turn education into an industry. Well, it's never been an industry. Education's been going on in the human race for thousands and thousands of years, and it's not until 1920 that we start deciding that we're going to run it through we're going to make an industry out of it and make and just put all these kids on an assembly line and then isolate their learning into little discrete packets. No, it doesn't work that way. The human brain does not work in terms of discrete packets of information. It works in terms of the ways in which information intersects and interacts and blends and reemerges into new ideas. And that froth that you get from that intergermination of different ideas from different people as well as from the different ideas that you get, that's what's important. The Brits never gave up on the tutoring system. They, too, are overburdened with too many kids, so their tutoring system has begun to devolve into what looks like an American educational system, and I sympathize with them. But the idea that you have a tutor who is knowledgeable in many subjects and who individually supervises a small group of students and helps guide them through learning as a group where they can talk and discuss and develop ideas. A smart tutor is the most valuable person in your society because the result is literally the Industrial Revolution. That's where that came from. Those people were the ones who went through that system, and they're the ones who created the modern world. Well, we've got a new world coming on, but we're not prepared for it because we're not educating these kids in a way that will allow them to grow in creativity and express their intelligence and their understanding. So,
yeah, I definitely agree with the sentiment of certain people are going to gravitate towards certain subjects.
They will.
They just prefer it,
right?
For whatever reasons.
Right.
Let's not get into why, because that's a big rabbit hole.
Right.
But I definitely look at certain kids, and I can tell the books that they're naturally reading, that are not on any assignments, that are just in their personal. They picked it up for whatever reason because that interested them.
Right.
They are not the same books. It's not like they're all going. They all went to the same classes, but their interests are still not different.
Right.
The same. They're still gravitating towards different things.
Right.
So having a non-bespoke, having a very bespoke rather, well, I could say it the other way. Having a non-bespoke way of teaching people where everything's routinized and everything's the same and everything's cookie cutter and bland, you're going to basically, you're going to make the best out of the mean. You're not going to make the best out of the best. Because the best are going to want to go do something more directly in line with their interests. And that's where they're going to gravitate towards. There's some kids that just really love robotics. They love getting their hands in machines. They like to see how things work.
Right. And some love to dance.
Exactly. And why are you trying to teach them each other's thing?
Right. Some love to play basketball.
Right.
Hey, those are good things.
Right.
I
think it's important for everyone to have a little bit of all of those things.
Oh, I agree.
Just so they get exposed to it and understand, that's not for me. I like it. It's neat. I'm really good friends with half the people on the baseball team, but I don't.
Right.
It's not for me.
I'm not gonna write a world history of basketball.
No.
I'm gonna go out there and learn how to make some dunks.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
So I think you're right, at least directionally right. And I haven't heard any good reasons to the contrary, but I do like the idea of testing people. I like the idea of knowing that, let's say, some percentage. It doesn't have to be 100% anywhere near that. Let's say 1% of the schools are doing a relatively good job. Because if they're not and the students are coming out and they're not learning something, okay, we've got a problem. We've got to intervene. And so I'm thinking, because I really don't know, maybe the idea was they did some testing and came back and these kids were at the standard that we'd expect in the other states or other countries or wherever, so that we have to start doing this.
Right. They haven't learned this degree of information according to our cookie cutter mold. Mm-hmm. Okay. What did they learn? Anybody ask that question? Mm-hmm. What did they learn? What did they want to learn? Mm-hmm. I think those.
How do you test for that though? Oof, that's so difficult.
Oh, wow.
Because it's literally the entire wealth of all human information.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So, but here's the tidal wave coming at us. Mm-hmm. And right now we're calling it Chat GPT, mm-hmm. right? And it's artificial intelligence writing college level essays for kids. So I downloaded the app, and I decided I'd play with it, and I asked some questions, and it answered my questions, and I collected 5 or 6 pages on a theme, and it was okay. If I had not been, or if I had not already known that it was artificial intelligence generating this stuff, and I had not already been familiar with the information I was asking it about, and it had been turned in as a freshman essay to me, I'll probably go to giving it a B or a B minus. Mm-hmm. And it was adequate. It wasn't genius, but it was adequate. Now that I know
so it passes your Turing test.
No. That's the interesting part. Knowing where it came from, I was able to analyze what it did, and I realized, among other things, it was just copying stuff off the internet.
Sure. Which no student has ever done.
No. and off the back, off the book cover, right? Off the book cover. So, and if I'd been more knowledgeable on that particular subject, I'd have caught it immediately. But the point of that is, that's the future of technology. Well, that changes. Doesn't do away with education. It changes the way we do education. And we have to be prepared for that change. And we have to be smart enough to make that work for us and not against us. So when you say, I want to test the kids, yeah, I do too. But I want to test them one-on-one. I want to test them in a classroom where I can watch them answer a question. I don't want to have 65 students that I've got to try to monitor, Mm-hmm. I've had classes that size.
Yeah, I know some very, very intelligent kids, and a question I would ask them to determine whether they're learning things would look completely different than somebody who I thought was, a median level of intelligence. I wouldn't bother asking them those questions because it's irrelevant. And vice versa. I'm not sure that these hyper intelligent kids would get this median level question. Right. Because it's kind of more about like popular culture or something that's
correct.
You know what I mean? Like it's about like current affairs or something like, it's like, oh, I don't really watch TV.
Right. Right. I'm into stamp collecting, not into,
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Not into Seinfeld. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a little, it's obvious to me anyway that you have to treat these kids very individually. You have to individualize their schooling, and even very young, I think that's true.
Absolutely. It's probably even more important very young. It's probably more important before age 6 than it is later. But yes, all kids are individuals. And that's the point I've been making, is that we ended up somehow falling into this idea that an assembly line educational process was going to work for us because it looked like an easy solution to the problem that we were having. But that problem was that we dropped out a bunch of individuals, and we ended up depressing the more creative kids. We should have had hundreds of 14-year-olds going to college and getting college degrees. We should have had hundreds of them in the last 20 years. We've got kids that smart in school. Why are they not going? Why are they being held back in their educational systems? Meanwhile, we have other kids, who have more mental capacities that need to be encouraged, and they need to be taught. Some of them have to be taught how to brush their teeth. Yep. I mean, we've got the human population in the United States is very broad, but if you focus on the people who have less capacity, on the assumption that the people who have higher capacity don't need that much instruction, well, what happens to these people? Mm-hmm. They don't get the encouragement. They drop out. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, the guy who is tested with the highest IQ alive in the United States today raises pigs in Minnesota.
He's probably happy as one.
Well, he looks back on his time and he thinks, I could have done a lot better job, but I'm okay here. Mm-hmm. He's got a wife. He raises pigs. Well, he's not using his intelligence. He's using his intelligence to stay alive. Mm. But he's not using his intelligence in the way in which it could have potentially changed the world. Mm-hmm. Could have changed the world.
I tend to agree. On the very young end, what I have seen is children being bucketized into the good kids versus bad kids.
Yes.
Which is very strange because all kids are kind of bad kids. Oh. I mean, they're really all pretty bad. It doesn't really matter. They're germ-ridden.
Yeah, the little barbarians.
They're terrible.
Yeah. I mean, the other name for an elementary school is a bioterrorism laboratory.
Jeez.
My gosh, every human disease floats freely in the hallways, on every surface.
Polio is back in the kindergarten.
Yeah, right.
And so... but what I see is these children that are clearly intelligent, clearly top thinkers about the things they enjoy.
Yeah.
And then you sit them down and you try to make them sit in a chair for 8 hours.
Can't do it.
Like, I mean, they're just going insane. Like, this is too slow. Like, I already understand this material. And like, I got accused of, not that I'm calling myself top level intelligence or anything, but I got accused of always slacking off in class. Like, he's so smart. He should do better in school. Like, I hated it. I hated school.
Right.
It just wasn't for me. It was
right.
a mix of too slow. And I always felt like the teachers didn't know what they were really talking about.
Yeah.
And and like, if I had that customized learning where people had really actually cared about me specifically, not just about the cohort of people who I was in a class with, I feel like that would have been very different for me and a lot of other people I know.
Yeah, right. There's an old Charlie Brown cartoon, done by Charles Schulz. And Charlie's walking home from school, and he says, the hardest thing in the world is the burden of a great potential.
Yeah, right. Oof. Yeah, I actually think intelligence and potential due to intelligence or great ability.
Yes.
I think those in the same realm is really more of an adversity than a benefit.
Yeah.
Because you really are now forced down a path. And a lot of people really resist. They don't want to do it. And they don't have the mentorship to help them realize why it's so good for them. And, it's...
Right. And this is going to have geopolitical consequences. The pandemic is going to have geopolitical consequences down the road because there's going to be a strata of students who didn't get the education that they needed at the time that they needed it. But it should be pointed out that if you take the top 10% of the students, top 10% of the best performing students, and assume those are honor students. Let's just arbitrarily call them honor students. They may not be. Mm-hmm. We'll call them honor students. There are more honor students in China than there are students in the United States.
Yep. Yeah, I've seen similar things out of India as well.
Correct. And if we do not have an educational system that is encouraging our students to reach for their universe of creativity so that we can keep up, we are going to be swamped.
I am really curious to hear what you think about this. So I have a number of friends who homeschool children.
Yes.
What do you think about that?
I think it's a wonderful idea.
Really?
I do. I think it's a bad idea if you're not very good at being educated yourself. I think that parents know more about their kids' abilities and their intelligences than anybody else. I think that a lot of parents have a very hard time keeping their kids on task. I think a lot of parents take the easy way out and purchase a curriculum from somewhere that attempts to do at home what attempts to build the assembly line process at home the same way they do it at school. But if you actually look at, as I said earlier in the show, if you actually look at the long history of human education, that's where it occurred. It occurs in the home, or it occurs with, as they get older, it occurs with tutors. You know, I mean, in medieval England, I don't know why I keep going back to England. It's just I know England better than other
I'll
countries. Yeah, thank you very much. In medieval England, you know, your son got to be 6 or 7 years old, and you shipped him off to your neighbor 30 miles away, and the neighbor shipped his son to you, so that there was not that familial bond between you, and the kid grew up in a different house being taught different skills from each family. Well, it helped create a tighter bond between the families, which was extremely useful, particularly in times of warfare. But it also removed that familial blockage that you get when you have a parent trying to deal with a kid. When you have a parent who's trying to deal with his or her own kid, and the kid doesn't want to make his bed in the morning, then instead of teaching the kid how to read or how to tell a story or how to draw a picture or how to act out a line of literature, or what do we need to know, and from a mathematical point of view, to determine how much the weight of the rain was that fell yesterday on our farm. You know, the weight, how much, you know, it's 2 inches. How much did it weigh? Mm-hmm. You know, what do we need to know? How do we solve that problem? That's creative thinking. Mm-hmm. If instead you're worried because kid didn't make his bed up, or didn't finish his breakfast, right, or hasn't yet taken the garbage out, where's the education?
Agreed.
Right?
Yeah, I have seen a kind of a hybrid model where I haven't seen this much, but a handful of families will band together and get one very good teacher, presumably, mm-hmm. to teach their 4 or 5 children or whatever in mm-hmm. a small, mm-hmm. I don't know, cluster. I don't know what the right word for that would be, a little cohort of kids. And the idea being they grow together, they're a team. It's not like they're at home with their parents. It's not like they don't have social interaction. Mm-hmm. It's like a very, very, very small school. But I've also read studies that seem to conflict a little bit with that theory, where it doesn't matter what the classroom size is. It basically, that's a misnomer. A class could be 500 people or 5 people. It really doesn't seem to matter very much. Mm-hmm. Statistically, it doesn't move the needle enough to make it matter. So then I think what you're really betting on is that teacher is the cream of the crop. That's the best teacher out there.
Right.
And I don't know how you vet that exactly. Sounds like another test. You know what I mean?
There's another test. Well, I'm not saying testing is wrong. You know,
a lot of money to be made in testing.
Well, certainly not a lot of money to be made in testing in Texas done the way it is.
I see.
And a lot of friends made a lot of money from their friends.
I see.
Mm-hmm.
So any thoughts on how we might fix all this big old mess of education?
Of course. You know, I'm a font of ideas. None of them are really genius level, but it's pretty obvious to me that individual attention to students makes a much more difference to what they learn and how they learn it than just sticking them in the back of the classroom and saying, do this, do this, do this, don't speak to me. Mm-hmm. And I've been in classes like that.
So getting rid of the standardized testing in general.
And getting rid of the sage on stage kind of thing, where it's the teacher delivering the information to the student and the student trying to copy it down. You know, in all of my years of teaching, what I realized is that 90% of the time, students are studying the teacher. They're not listening to what the teacher says. They're studying the teacher because what they want to know is, why is this person interested in this subject?
Right.
If you're not interested in that subject, you better not be teaching it. Because that's your job. Your job as a teacher is to help the students understand why this is interesting to you.
Yeah, it's so funny though. I don't disagree that doesn't work at a education level, let's say 9th grade or below kind of thing. I think that definitely. But as we get older, that's exactly what we end up doing. We go to conferences and we'll have the sage on stage who's teaching all of us how to do like cardiovascular surgery, or here's how to break into websites in a more interesting way, or whatever. Or even in law school, for instance, you'll have the Socratic method of the teacher who's just picking on individuals until they can come up with a concise reason why their case is correct or wrong or whatever. So I think maybe that's a type of education that adults, they are exposed to in their daily life, and they expect that would probably translate back to an era that they don't remember. They don't remember being a child in that seat and getting antsy after 2 hours sitting there listening to the same person talk over and over.
Well, and you bring up the idea of the Socratic method. Well, it's been a very effective teaching method for 2,500 years. It's still a very effective teaching method. The nature of the Socratic dialogue is it's a one-on-one exchange. And Socrates proposes an idea, and he says, what do you think about it? And then he says, and why do you think that? And then he says, let's take a look at your first premise. You said, now why did you say that? What do you think justifies that premise?
And why do you think you said that about that?
Right. Well,
investigating, interrogating the language.
Yeah, not just the language,
yeah,
but also helping to develop the mind of the student in a one-to-one exchange. Well, even if there's a group of people standing around listening to this.
So I say language because of the word can't. I rail on this fairly regularly. You know, people say, I can't do X, I can't do Y.
Yeah.
They can. So why did you say you can't? Okay, what am I trying to actually say here by saying these words?
Yeah. Right.
So a lot of times it is language, but your point is absolutely valid. Yes, it's more than language.
Right. And that is a valid traditional system. So of education. I mean, it's extremely useful and extremely effective. Honestly, I don't know how it would translate to calculus. I wonder. On the other hand,
it's probably how calculus was invented, actually.
Yeah. Well, actually, Sir Isaac Newton said he invented calculus, and I've got some stories to tell you about Isaac Newton if you're interested.
Oh, sure, yeah. Go for it.
But
Isaac Newton, the man who was completely right about everything and also completely wrong at the same time.
Well,
really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, Halley's Comet is named after the guy who rescued Newton's work from obscurity. Edmund Halley became Isaac Newton's friend and companion, and he walked into Isaac Newton's upper story rooms, which were over the main gate at Trinity College in Cambridge on the second floor, where he could get plenty of sunlight to do his work with prisms, and the place was an absolute jumble of papers, and Halley said, "What's all this?" And then he said, "Oh, it's just some calculations I've been doing. I mean, figuring out gravity, and I'm just, I figured out gravity. I figured out how the planet. I figured out prisms. I figured out light refraction. I figured out angles. And Halley pulled it all together, and that's how the Principia Mathematica got published, and it's the single most important book, a scientific book, maybe to ever be published.
Yeah, it's close. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Maybe ever to be published. But Newton himself was really not a very pleasant person to be around. He was this tall, carried a cane, beat people with it.
I think Socrates was also renowned for smelling bad and yelling at people.
That's why I'm convinced. It's why the Greeks finally got rid of him.
He's my spirit animal. Yeah. I'm just gonna stop bathing right now. Yeah. That guy's great.
He won't take a bath. Let's kill him.
It's not a bad point. I might have to use that.
Yeah, I don't. Now we've wandered off, and I'm thinking about Isaac Newton. I'm sorry.
No,
I don't know where we were.
I love Isaac Newton. He's a great guy.
Yeah. Well, so I spent a year in Trinity College, Cambridge.
That's what you think about England all the time,
yeah.
because I've been there.
I spent a year there. I spent a year
that makes sense.
in the Wren Library at Trinity College. Christopher Wren, who also is the architect for St. Paul's in downtown London, among other many famous buildings. He built this library. It's a beautiful library. It's 40 feet wide. It's 40 feet tall. It's 120 feet long. And after several months of ingratiating myself to the library and staff, I was finally given permission, which has almost never happened with anybody else who hasn't been employed, permission to wander through the library and look at things. Well, they have one of the most outstanding collections of manuscripts in the world. Handwritten copies of poems by Milton and Tennyson and Byron, and I mean, not just first edition. This is the stuff that was written from the pens that they were holding at the time. And Isaac Newton had been.
What is that, 0th edition?
Yeah, right. This is the original, right? This is what got sent to the printer, or this is what got written before the final version got written to be sent to the printer, and all of Isaac Newton's books are collected there in the library. There's a nook. It's about the size of this room, lined with bookcases, and it's all these books that belong to Isaac Newton. I had a friend. And his death mask, because that was typical in those days. If he dies and goes in the grave, we'll never remember what he looked like. That's a what shall we call it? An idea that has outlived its usefulness to us.
Now we have Facebook.
Right. Right. Yeah, now we have
and YouTube and
and Facebook pages that never go away. Right. Yeah. So all his books are there. His walking stick is there. It's really and you can tell basically how tall he was from how short the stick was. Genius man, absolutely genius man. Probably crazy late in life. Certainly a very unpleasant person. I made a friend who was studying physics at another one of the Cambridge colleges, who said, "What can you come? Can I come over and visit the Wren Library and just get a tour with you? Can you walk me around and show me what's going on?" I said, "Yeah, sure. Come on." So I mentioned it to the librarians. Wonderful staff, absolutely wonderful staff at the library. I said, "I have this friend who's coming over from Keys or somewhere, and he studies physics, and he wants to see the Isaac Newton stuff. And is there anything else in the library that you think he might be interested to see?" So the librarian said, "Sure," and or the sub-librarian, and he said, Trevor is his name. Trevor said, "Sure. Just when is he coming?" I said, "No, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning." He said, "No problem." So at 10 o'clock the next morning, my friend shows up. We walk around the library. It's beautiful. It's got a checkered marble floor. It's beautiful wood carvings by Grunwald Gibbons, and it's a 40-foot soaring ceiling. It's just an absolutely gorgeous place. And we got all the way back to the back corners on the far back side on the right, and on the table, the librarian had laid out a couple of things that he thought my friend would be interested in seeing as a physicist. One of them was the manuscript of the opening pages of the Mathematica Principia. One page. They had all of it, but he just put out one page. And next to it was a letter from Albert Einstein. And right there, 500 years of the most brilliant minds in physics.
Yeah.
In the history of mankind.
Math and physics.
Yeah.
Those guys did both.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. I mean, Einstein is the guy who revolutionized Newtonian physics. It's just changed the way we thought of it. It's fascinating. Yeah. I love that those kinds of events can happen. Mm-hmm. And as you can tell, I'm fairly passionate about this stuff. And I will help educate you by raising your interest.
Yes,
and
of course.
sparking your sense of wonder and creativity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's what a teacher does.
Yeah. I actually like that a lot. Well, I disagree with you, sir. That's what a good teacher does.
Well, true. I've
met a lot of teachers who are not that
some of the
caliber.
Some of the most sadistic.
Yes.
Fill in the blank. I've ever met were teachers.
Yeah,
and some of the most bored people.
Yeah, I would say the kind of teacher I think is both great and terrible at the same time, because they're the best in the world at it, and they're the worst teachers of it. They will say, here's the thing I have to teach you. This is the curriculum I've created, and you don't know it, you fail. It's like, whoa.
Right.
Like, not everybody is going to pick up every concept as quickly as you want them to pick it up. Like, some people will, they'll burst, they'll pick it up really quickly and then they'll lull, and then really quickly and lull. And so I've definitely seen teachers who have just taught too many people, and they probably should have retired, 10, 20 years earlier, because their passion is gone. Their passion for teaching is gone. But very good teachers, I've had a few of them that I can remember off the top of my head that were they were so passionate about it that it was infectious, and not necessarily in subjects that I would normally gravitate towards. So that was it was refreshing to see that. So,
well, a teacher who treats students with dignity and compassion and understanding, and who is genuinely interested in the subject, will be a good teacher. That teacher will be a good teacher.
Yeah, in the college context, I would say that the biggest delta were the ones who were willing to meet with me afterwards.
Yes.
Those were almost always better teachers, just on the whole.
Because they were available.
They made themselves available, and they wanted to talk to you. They wanted to tell you some cool things about what is going on. And,
right. Yes.
It was a passion for them.
Well, yeah. And a good teacher recognizes the fact that just because the person happens to be 19 years old doesn't mean they haven't come up with some pretty good ideas of their own.
Yeah.
Maybe we can share some stuff here, and I can learn something.
That does happen.
I can learn something, right? As a teacher, I can learn something.
That definitely happens.
Yeah. One of the other things at Trinity College is a manuscript which actually was written by a 19-year-old student at Trinity College and won the Nobel Prize. And it was the first description of the way in which cold temperatures affect electronic transmissions. He'd been skiing in the Alps and realized that his battery and his flashlight lasted longer at altitude in the cold than it lasted when he was down. So he ran some tests, he wrote it up, he figured it out, he did the mathematics, he 63 pages later, he was finished, and he had a Nobel Prize as well as a degree from Trinity College. Those kinds of people like that exist.
Yeah, absolutely.
And some of them exist in Austin, Texas.
Yeah.
So
I remember I ran into this one guy. He was very high up in the security industry when I started, so he was already quite in the little thing there, and he was a very good mathematics individual, so we were good at cryptography specifically. And I asked him kind of like, I know you're like past school now, but like what grade would you be if you were like still in school? Like what, like if you had and he's like trying to do the math. He's like 26th, I think. I'm like, fair enough. There's just those people out there.
There are.
And he's a really, really fascinating guy, actually. Okay, well, let's talk about your book.
Okay. So some of what we've been talking about applies to the book.
I think so, exactly. Yeah. So, first of all, give us some premise. How'd you come up with this idea, and what is it?
A couple of things you probably ought to know before we actually get into talking about the book. And one of them is that the stories that are in the book are mostly true. You can't tell everything that you know. So I changed names, I changed locations. I invented a fictitious town, a fictitious county, fictitious characters. But the ribs of the story, the skeleton of the story, are all true events. So the story is about a series of murders that occurs in East Texas, and it's not so much it's not really a mystery. You really kind of know who is doing all of this. The the question is, why is he doing it? That's what the story's about. Why is he doing this stuff? So it's hard to peg as a murder mystery. I don't think I would call it a murder mystery.
Sure.
But it is true crime in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a newspaper reporter in this area, owned a newspaper, and you have no idea what owning a small town newspaper is like, except that you get to know everybody and their dogs.
Like literally.
Literally, yes.
They're actual dogs, not
they're actual dogs.
It's not a euphemism for something.
Right, and their pickups and the license plates on their pickups, and and in a small town, you might as well live in a glass house, because what people don't know about you, they'll make up. So there's really no difference between that and living in an actual glass house. And that, it's a community, and that's the way we are as a community. So the story is about a series of murders, and I follow the career of the villain up to a certain point. The narrator of the story is a newspaper reporter his job is not an enviable one. I think people don't understand how hard it is to be a journalist. So that was one of my...
Can you tell us why?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, it's the long hours. And the hours really are long. But also the money is hard. The old saying is that in January, publishers eat snow. Well, yeah, they do, because they got all their money at Christmas time for the ads. And the merchants have spent all the money they have on advertising in December. So you don't have any advertising, and you have to have advertising to support the newspaper. So it's a matter of squeaking through, cutting corners over and over and over. And one of the ways in which you do that is you save a lot of money and you do a lot of work, and you're not on a 40-hour work week. You're on a 100-hour work week.
Especially if you own it.
And if you own it, yeah,
that's
because
even worse.
You feel that constant gnawing at your back. Mm-hmm. So I was fortunate in the way that I got set up. My situation with I newspaper is not the situation this character has, but it is in East Texas. And one of the things I tried to do was capture the kind of folksy community spirit of the place, and how those people respond to a world in which fatal things can happen to you from any direction. The world itself in East Texas can be pretty dangerous, but no more dangerous there than it is in West Texas, or Sweetwater, Texas is famed for its rattlesnakes, and they have a Miss Rattlesnake contest every year. and the girls who win it are always beautiful. But yeah, and then they have rattlesnake chili, and they have rattlesnake sausage, and they have but rattlesnakes are just rattlesnakes are a metaphor,
sure, for
the danger of nature. And no matter how advanced we become as human beings, we still live in a nature that can be fairly dangerous to us. But we have more to fear from one another sometimes. Mm-hmm. And so in order to protect ourselves from one another, we have to develop this mask that we use in our relationships. And the purpose of the mask is to separate us from one another. And so when you enter a place, you go through this ritual. When you meet another man, as a man, when you meet another man, you go through this ritual where you have to put on your mask and you have to appear to be someone who cannot be intimidated, right? And it's the tilt of the chin and the direction of the eye and the sound of the voice and and how's it hanging, Joe? And you better have an answer for that one. And I don't know, let me check, is probably not the correct answer. So,
do you want to check is even a worse answer.
yeah, well, yeah, right. Yeah, do you want to check?
Wouldn't recommend that one. Guys, don't take that one
right.
well.
Right. So there are, but there's this little ritual that you go through. And then once you get through the ritual, the masks are off and you can be honest and open with one another. You can sit shoulder to shoulder, elbow to elbow, drink coffee, tell jokes, have a great time. But there's always that introductory. It can happen every day with the same people. Mm-hmm. Every day with the same people. But sometimes you run into people who are not people that you are familiar with. Well, then you go through the ritual and the mask doesn't come off. And you kind of circle one another, trying to figure one another out. And what is this person really saying? And everybody, at that point, everybody tries to look tough and dangerous. Everybody.
I've certainly met people like that. Absolutely.
It's easy to find them in Texas, I think. But in East Texas, there's that little ritual that you go through. So,
is it easier to find those people in East Texas versus
I don't know. I'm not sure.
Downtown Austin.
I think, there are bars in Austin where you would better be prepared to leave if you read the room and decided you weren't welcome. Mm-hmm. And there are places like that. But in East Texas, in these little small communities in East Texas where people have been basically isolated for 100 years or more, the whole towns are that way. Sometimes the whole town is that way. And it takes a while to get to the point where you are familiar enough to them that they will relax a little around you and open up, and you can become friends with them.
So they're cordial, they're just distant.
Yes, right. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, that's one way to put it. Yeah, but it's also this kind of macho, mm-hmm. I'm tougher than you attitude. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example.
Were they tougher? Could you have taken them? I'm just being funny.
I would not.
The answer is yes.
To them, the answer is yes. I had a little sign I put on my desk. I said, "I'm too fat to run and and too big to hide. You know where to find me." Yeah. So I'll tell you what I did. The sheriff, the new sheriff, was going through, and he was. It was a dry county, so you weren't supposed to sell alcohol in the county. So
wow, that's amazing that those still exist.
Yeah, it does. Well, it just recently changed. I mean, it's no longer a dry county, but it's only recently changed. So the sheriff was going through, and he would go down to certain sections of town, and he would bust people for selling alcohol out of the trunks of their car, and he'd end up with 30 or 40 cases of beer. And then he'd take it out to the dump, and all the deputies would go out and line up out there and have target practice at the different bottles and cans of beer.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure a few went missing as well.
No one counted. No one counted.
Mm-hmm.
So I went and bought myself a 45 long Colt, 45 caliber long Colt pistol, revolver. Smith & Wesson, 6-inch barrel. Hog leg. It's a hog leg of a pistol. And I practiced with it. Shot maybe 1,000 rounds through it. And then one day he said, "Well, we're going out to shoot the beer at the county dump." And I said, "I'd like to come along."
Yeah.
And he said, "Okay." So up until then, it'd been kind of shaky, my relationship with all of them. So I went out there. I took some pictures of them shooting beer cans. And then I pulled my gun out. And I shot 6 cans of beer off a hill at 30 yards. And from that point on, I noticed they were very cooperative.
You were one of them.
I was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. So that you do kind of go through those initiation rites, I think.
I definitely know what you're talking about. It doesn't really happen to me that often these days. I think Maybe it's because I've got a bit of a reputation. I don't know. And or I'm a pretty affable person and I don't really care. So they wanted to post up and I'm like, okay, fine. I guess you can beat me up. Anyway, can we have this meeting or like, I don't really care.
Right.
Can we move on?
Yeah.
And or I really think that a lot of that is insecurity. And
Yes,
so when
I
I just stop caring immediately, then they're like, oh, you're not going to do that back. I'm like, no, I don't really care. Can we just keep talking? Like, you seem interesting. What's your story? And very quickly, those boundaries just kind of become permeable. And
I agree. Yeah, it's an insecurity thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. But the fact that it occurs every single day with the same people is kind of interesting to me. So,
the berries come back up?
Yeah.
Oh,
berries,
really?
Yeah. They come back up, and then you have to go through the whole little ritual again. You know, somewhere I've described it as the human equivalent of dogs sniffing butts. So,
but over and over, that's interesting.
But over and over, yeah. I mean, well, my dogs do it, don't they? You know, they know those dogs that are out there, and they
still do it anyway.
They'll do it anyway. It's sort of the social pattern. So it's fascinating.
I wonder if that's learned behavior.
It is.
That does not sound like
I'm
normal.
sure it is.
Because normally you see the same person 50 times, and you're like, oh, that's Joe. Like, hey, how you doing, Joe?
Right. And the same pickup and the same cigarette butts and all that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the things about East Texas that just drives West Texans absolutely crazy is there's no horizon. You drive into, my brother-in-law's from San Angelo. You drive into East Texas, and he can stay there for about 30 minutes before he starts looking around sort of wild-eyed because he can't see anywhere. There's nothing but trees. As far as you can look, there's nothing but trees. There's no place you can go except
more trees.
More trees. As far as you climb the top of the water tower, and you can see trees, but you can't see land. There's no horizon. So it's, and
coming from California, that is a weird thing because normally you navigate by a mountain or the ocean or whatever, and so you really don't have that.
Right.
I mean, downtown Austin, there's a lot more. There's some geography. There's some movement of they call it hill country in some areas. And, but I know where you're talking. I know that area you're talking about. It just goes on forever and ever.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing about East Texas is it's kind of an uneasy marriage between sort of West Texas independence, that sense of West Texas independence, and a deep South nostalgic sort of longing for a forgotten aristocracy.
And aristocracy of what kind? What do you mean?
Well, the planters were aristocratic, right? They were the American aristocracy. They were so wealthy that nothing mattered. Kind of like the oil barons in Houston today. Just so wealthy that there was nothing that they needed. So there was no way in which they could be circumvented if there was something they wanted.
It sounds a little bit like an appeal towards authoritarianism. That's interesting.
It is, I think. And I think
but it's weird that it would pass down generationally like that.
It does. Well, the other thing about East Texas is that it's isolated. It's just very difficult to get anywhere in East Texas. There are very few roads, even in Texas, that go east and west. There are two interstates across the state, east and west, and
you can spend all day on one and still be in Texas.
Oh man, I mean, Texas basically begins at Beaumont on the eastern border with Louisiana, and it goes 840 miles to El Paso. Well, Beaumont, as it turns out, is midway between Jacksonville, Florida, and El Paso.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a big state.
Texas is a big state.
Texas is a big state, and it has a lot of different little cultures in it. But the ones in East Texas, because of the isolation, and because of the transportation problems, the flow of people has not ever been very great. So people don't move in
And why would you? Is there any sort of industry or anything?
Well, I mean, there's
any natural resources.
There's timber.
Timber.
In the county where we lived and where my wife grew up, it's 95% timber. It's 1,000 square miles, and it's 95% timber. And that includes that 5% includes all the paved roads, all the parking lots, of which there are a few. All the fields of hay. And
how many people in this town?
In the town, in the book, there's 1,800. In the town she grew up, there was 2,200 maybe. Mm-hmm. So it's similar in that regard. Small place. It's a small place. There are more people in this street than there are in that town where we are, the street where we are.
Yeah.
So, and the people there have been there for generations because nobody's moved in. Their kids grow up and move out, and sometimes they'll come back to raise their own kids because they had a good time as kids growing up, and they do, or they inherit property there and they come back to manage it. But basically, the town where she grew up, the population didn't change by as much as 100 people for over 100 years.
Wow.
Yes, I mean, steady state, steady state.
So that must mean people are egressing. They're leaving. If they look for, if they're adventurous or whatever, military or something, they just leave.
Right, and some of them
because you would naturally have some population growth.
Right.
Otherwise.
Right. Otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's not there are babies being born. Mm-hmm. So, but as they grow up, they go off to college and then they stay off usually, or they go in the military, or, as you say, or they go to Houston and look for a job, or they go offshore, working on oil rigs. But for the most part, the only business in that area is timber, and timber can be a fairly brutal industry. A lot of really good people who make their living cutting trees and planting them again. And it's a viable and wealthy business, but if it rains, you don't cut timber, because you can't get your trucks into the woods. Well, it rains all the time. It rains all the time. There'll never be a drought in East Texas. Never.
It's pretty close to the ocean there.
Well, yeah, I mean, where we were was about 70 miles inland.
Okay. All right.
So, but I mean, yeah, an hour drive basically from the ocean, and you get and it's it's kind of rolling grass plains from that point on down to the ocean. Then the hills suddenly rise, and it's like there's a rim of hills around that area. Used to be 100 million acres, and it's called the Big Thicket. And I don't know that the actual geology would bear this out, but if you look at the Gulf of Mexico, it looks like a huge crater, from some asteroid strike, or
mass erosion of some sort.
Right? And you can find oil down 30,000 feet, so something happened. Those were all living organisms at one time.
Sure.
But you go inland about 80 miles and you run into a line of hills. It's about 750 to 950 feet above sea level. That's the highest point between the Gulf of Mexico and the Ozarks in Arkansas.
Very flat.
Yeah, but there's that line of hills, and if you look at the territory south of that line of hills, it actually has, for example, it has every species of hardwood tree that grows in America grows there.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
And north of
even
those
like
hills,
redwoods and.
No, those are not hardwoods.
Oh, they are?
Yeah, no, redwoods are a conifer.
Oh, wow, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, right. 27 different species of oaks, dozens of unique orchids, cacti growing next to orchids, growing next to trilliums, It's an absolutely incredible place. 390 species of birds. It's unbelievable, the natural wealth of the place. And it survived that wealth survived largely because it was inaccessible. People managed to literally chop out a place to put some farms and grow a little corn, and at one time cotton. But the rest of the time they were cutting timber and selling it down the river to Beaumont, where it became the lumber that built the rest of America. But they didn't build. They sent the lumber to those places. So what I'm talking about is a place called the Big Thicket. And the Big Thicket is it's been designated by the United Nations as a unique biosphere, one of 7, I think, on the planet. And it is, and the United States has created a national preserve down there. And it's really fascinating, and I urge people to go and look at it. 2 kinds of carnivorous plants.
Don't put your finger in it.
Yeah. Ooh, mommy, look.
So in this ecosystem, you have these characters,
right,
who are very isolated, I think is probably what we're going for.
Yes. They're isolated from the rest of the world. So the only updates they have on the way the world is going are through pretty limited television access. And that was pretty scratchy. A lot of static in that television reception.
And what time was this? What time?
And the book
60s?
The book is set in the late 70s, early 80s.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. In the county where I had the newspaper, there were 2 stoplights, 1,000 people, right? 1,000 square miles. There are 2 stoplights. 2 stoplights. Mm-hmm. They were within 1 block of one another. No, I'm not kidding.
I know.
Literally, on the street that ran in front of the courthouse for 1 block, there was a stoplight, and then there was a stoplight, and that was it. There were no other stoplights in the county.
Mm-hmm. The judge was tired of having his car hit.
Yeah. Well, and the town had always been poor, so they bought the stoplights from another town that had decided to upgrade. So, so those are stoplights that were put in the 1950s, right, and are still in operation and still using those incandescent bulbs. And every once in a while, they'll send somebody out in a truck and change the bulbs out because they burned out. It's fascinating.
Wow, fascinating.
Things don't move quickly in East Texas. The people don't move around quickly. Ideas don't float very quickly. So it's an interesting culture, and that was the kind of culture I tried to capture in this book, and capture through the eyes of the newspaper reporter who's not from there. He comes and moves in, and he's observing this world. The villain of the book is a kid who drops out of high school. And if you drop out of school, if you just give up with school, then you're condemned to a life of ignorance, that's worse than a prison sentence. As they say, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. Mm-hmm. And some people do. That's what they choose, and the result is they miss out on critical thinking skills that they might have been able to develop if they had been paying any attention, or if they had had a teaching system, an educational system that helped them or encouraged them to do that. And the result of not having critical thinking skills is that you just go through life reacting to things. Mm-hmm. And as I said earlier, you can do anything in this country you want to do, but you're free to do anything you want to do, but you're not free to choose the consequences of your behavior. And unless you have critical thinking skills, you can't figure out what those consequences are, and he doesn't. Well, I'm going to cut to the chase here on this character.
Sure.
And this is the part of the story that is based on actual events. The villain decides he's going to go next door and steal food from his neighbor because he's hungry. And he thinks he sees her drive off. Well, he knows he sees her drive off So he assumes she's going to be gone for a while, so he goes over and breaks into her house and starts going through her refrigerator. Well, unknown to him, she comes back with her 2-year-old daughter in tow. He kills both of them, puts their bodies in the trunk of her car, and drives off and drops the bodies about 40 miles away in an abandoned barn. Then he drives back to her house, leaves her car, goes back inside, steals a 2-pound package of frozen meat from her refrigerator, and as he's about to leave, he looks around and he sees a jar of pennies sitting on the counter, and he decides to grab that jar of pennies. And it was that piece of evidence that ended up sending this man to the death chamber in Huntsville. He was executed for it. He was the first person executed in 2000, in the state of Texas.
Wow.
And that's a true story. And one of the reasons...
The thinking it takes to want to go back after all of that, I mean...
And then to steal food. And
I mean, the money kind of makes sense at least, but why would you go back to the scene of the crime?
Right.
Right. Wow.
Yeah. Well, you know, he was still hungry.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this happens to people. And people who don't learn who don't acquire the education that we're trying to give them, they end up like this.
And would you describe this person as mentally insane, or were they just very ignorant, or drugs, or what was sort of the mentality?
Well, he may have had some brain damage from an accident,
mm-hmm.
And that in fact happened to the real guy. But it'd been 40 years or 20 years after the accident that he committed the crime. One of the things that stuck with me about that story is that I met this guy at my newspaper. We had a distribution manager. I would go for 2 days without sleep, getting the paper together, maybe an hour of sleep. And then on Tuesday night, we sent it to the press. And on Wednesday morning, my distribution manager would collect it. He'd bag up the papers that had to be mailed out. And then he would drive around the county putting out the papers in the coin racks to be sold to the public. Well, on this particular morning, he called me up at about 4 a.m. and he said, "John, the press broke down, and we're not going to make the deadline to get to the post office unless we get some more help down here." I said, "I'm on my way." And he said, "Well, I've got some people I can hire. Do you mind if I add some extra work? I can call them in. It's 4 a.m, but they'll come in." I said, "Yeah, sure." So I pulled on my jeans and a T-shirt and went down there to help them bag the papers and get them addressed. You have to address all these papers in these big mail sacks, and there's a limit to how much the sacks can weigh. And, the post office has all these regulations. Well, one of the people that he had called was his son, who was working, and I came in, I met him. I spoke with him. I watched him work. I watched the others work. I figured they were all doing their job. I would do my part. They would do their part. We'd get the paper out. We did. We got it distributed. Everything was fine. Well, the son is the one who ends up being the murderer. So I had that personal connection with him. I don't know how many people have met a murderer in person before he commits the murder. But I did. And
what was your impression?
He was a large man. He was large, kind of shaggy looking. I mean, not shaggy in the sense of messy or unkempt or anything, just one of those people whose posture was, his arms just hung down by his side kind of thing. And he was friendly enough. Didn't strike me as being a genius. and
Hardworking.
yeah, he did. He worked hard. He was hardworking. Yeah, I was glad he was there, but because he was doing his job, I didn't have to pay any attention to him. So I just remember. But then, about 30 minutes later, my distribution manager comes to me and he says, I know you got a little girl at home. I did. I was a 7-year-old daughter. And he said, I hate to say this about my son, but no matter what happens, do not let your daughter get close to my son. Keep her away. Well, that's the kind of thing that a young dad, I think I was 34 at that time, it's the kind of thing a young dad remembers.
Yeah, I would remember that too.
You know, you remember that, and you think through your head, okay, the daughter's home, her mother's there, everything's fine. I know I locked the door when I left. But then the next day, and then the next day, and then the next day, and then a year later, and 2 years later, and 10 years later, and then the murder occurs, and then he gets arrested, and I go, oh my God, I knew this guy. And then...
And you had a warning, too.
And I had a warning.
It's not just that you knew
somebody knew that he was a person who needed to be watched. You know, that he may not...
Did you find out why? Why?
Yeah, well, I mean, his dad said he'd been in a car accident, he'd rolled his pickup truck, and he thinks he may have suffered some brain damage because his personality changed after the wreck. So maybe that's what happened. I loved his dad. His rest of his family's just wonderful.
There are some circuits like the inhibition circuits and rage circuits that are kind of vaguely related to one another that could have gone out. Or whatever.
Oh yeah. Well, and who knows what kind of brain damage it would take to knock something like that out. I mean, I'm not a neurosurgeon. I don't know what areas of the brain got injured, and I wasn't there. I don't know what kind of accident he actually suffered.
It tends to usually be frontal or back just because that's how people are traveling.
Right, yeah.
So a lot of brain trauma is very similar to one another because of that fact.
Right, and if you have brain trauma to the front of your forehead, you're also losing some logical capacity, or the potential to lose some logical capacity.
And very often if you have it in the front, you also have it in the back because your brain kind of sloshes around in there.
Yeah, right.
So it's often very similar. But
it is. And so it was an awful thing, and it's just something that stuck with me. And now it's been 20 years later, and I've written a book about it, and
this really stuck with you.
It really stuck with me. But then
because this could have been you and your family.
Yes, it could have. It wouldn't have, but it could have. I paid a lot of attention to how my family was situated. Somebody could have broken in, but I don't think that would have happened without some different circumstances. We didn't live out in the country, for example, like they did. Mm-hmm. I was always careful to know my neighbors and for my neighbors to know me. So, and I had a dog, so.
Sure.
Yay for teeth, right?
Yeah.
Canines are useful.
Yeah, those strong jaws.
Yep. So, and noisy. They're noisy little.
Yeah.
Yep. So.
Well, that's a pretty incredible story. So, does your story also follow the evidence chain as well? Like how this all kind of...
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how it all came about and what happens. Well, and in the process of discovering the people, this was so hard on the woman's husband. It was so hard because automatically the first thing a law enforcement person will do is say, well, you're our prime suspect, right? Your wife disappeared and your kids disappeared, so you're the prime suspect because you're the last one to see him. It's so hard. I mean, when you know that it wasn't you.
Yeah.
And are they looking for anybody else?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
Because they've already said, you're our suspect. Are they looking for anybody else? And given what we know about the people who end up in law enforcement, sometimes they don't look for other people. A lot of that depends on your social standing. and on how long you've lived in the neighborhood. I mean, it just does.
Mm-hmm. Whether they shot cans that day or not.
Right.
Coming home a little sloppy.
Right.
I mean, it's a thing. It does actually, that kind of thing does occur sometimes.
Right. So, I mean, it was awful. It was awful from every aspect. It was awful from every angle you can look at it. And particularly awful for the husband who lost his wife and daughter. And the wife had never been taller than 4'11". And this guy, who's in the book, he's called Jesse Grinder, and this guy he's 6'4".
Wow.
And
it's a monster.
And he's been working in the woods, so he's been picking up 400-pound logs. I mean, he's muscular. He knows what he's doing. Well, he doesn't know what he's doing. He knows he has strength. He has physical strength. And he's survived up to this point in his life because he had physical strength and he didn't mind doing boring work. Mm-hmm. So that's, but again, he was a high school dropout. Not every high school dropout ends up murdering somebody and being executed by the state of Texas. Thank God.
Jinx. Christ, jeez.
I mean, it could be worse. It could be worse. But, yeah, so there's that. Well, another major character in the book is Charles Henniger. And Charles Henniger is a retired Air Force colonel. People don't hear about the Special Forces unit in the Air Force as much as they do about the...
Those are like PJs? Is that right?
Well, they're commandos. They're literally Air Force commandos. Mm-hmm. That's what they're called. There's, you have the Army Rangers, and people hear about the Army Rangers, and you have the SEALs, and people hear about the Navy SEALs. Yep. You don't hear about the Air Commandos. Well, what they do is they rescue pilots, basically.
Yeah, PJs, right? Yeah. Isn't that the other name for them?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. Well, that's what he was, but he was a colonel, so he was way up there. And he retires. He's 42. He's retired, and he'd been previously married. His wife dies, and he's got an extensive family in, about 20 miles or 40 miles away in East Texas, and he's got his master's degree from, some northern college in political science, and he decides he's going to do what his wife would have wanted him to do. Mm-hmm. He's got a nice retirement income, and so he moves to this little town and puts in an application to be a high school teacher, and they hire him. He's black. So he has to deal with all of the racial stereotypes that are so prevalent throughout Texas, but certainly in East Texas. And he also has to learn how to teach. And he has this commitment to teaching because he realizes that the only way war will ever end is if you have intelligent people, if you have educated people. That war is a result of ignorance and stupidity. It's always the result of ignorance and stupidity.
And a vicious desire for power.
And a vicious desire for power.
And sometimes a straight-up disregard or hatred for other people. Sometimes it's literally just hatred.
Sometimes it is. That's right. The Balkans are a good example of that. The war in Ukraine is a good example of that. It's just hatred.
So why this part of this story? Why now? Is this relevant to what actually happened, or is this more of a commentary? Like why that part of the story?
Well, I decided I needed a character who would balance the villain, the Jesse Grinder. And I decided that I would take a person who was absolutely the opposite in all regards. So I created Charles Henniger, an educated black man who feared nobody, could not be intimidated, had an officer's bearing, and was willing to submit himself to the terrors of the classroom. A lot of people would get pretty scared in a high school classroom if they weren't fairly secure themselves. And with good reason, because 16, 17-year-olds can be pretty intimidating. They can be frightening.
You just need to have a gun on you. They'll calm down.
or they need to understand that if they're carrying a gun, it's not going to help them.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
And being an exceptionally fit and intelligent person who wants his students to succeed and to think and he figures out ways to make the learning fun. And so there's some examples of him doing that, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, dealing with the racial prejudice that crops up all the time over there. And I personally, I think it balanced out pretty well. I think it's those are diametrically opposed people, and at the end of the book, he's the one who helps subdue the villain. And the jar of pennies is what helps send the villain to them.
Yeah, you mentioned that before. So what about the pennies was the linchpin?
Well, it finally found in his possession.
I see.
Yeah, they finally found. He didn't throw the jar away. They found the jar, and it had her fingerprints on it. So there you are.
It's about as much of a smoking gun as you can ask for.
Well, and once they had that, he confessed. Yeah. So they had a confession. You can't confess to a capital murder charge. You know, that has to be proved by the state. You can't. They won't execute you just because you say you did it. They have to prove it. But they proved it.
Wow.
Yeah. Fascinating, fast-paced story. And, you know, one of the things that I realized writing this book is that, let me back up. Let me just say, I don't know when the last time was you went to a funeral.
Pretty recently, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. Right. And I'm looking at one in the next couple of days.
Sorry.
Thank you. My next door neighbor, wonderful man, 82. Every funeral I've been to, sooner or later, somewhere in the ceremony, remembering this person's life, they start telling funny things that the person did.
Of course.
And laughing about it.
That's the only way. You got to make fun of them.
Well, and they can't answer, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's the best time. You finally get the last word.
Right. So why in our most solemn states of grief do we turn to humor for relief? And it occurs to me that humor may be the only way we can deal with terror. Otherwise, we are overwhelmed by terror for ourselves, that we too
are mortals.
Remember, O Caesar, thou art mortal. Yeah, right. So, writing the book, I realized, you know what? The way this really works is it has to have humor in it. It has to have humor in it. Okay, you know, I'm a literary guy, right? You know, I have a graduate degree in literature. I'm sorry, everybody. You don't have to worry about spelling words in front of me or your grammar. I'm not going to call you.
Good thing. My grammar's really not great.
You've done a very good job today. Thank you. I'm A+ on your grammar. So naturally, I've read all of Shakespeare.
As one would.
As one would. I mean, why not?
Yeah. It's there.
Yeah, it's there. It's there to be read.
Almost every single literary fictional story has been based on it in some form or another.
Yep.
Useful.
I used to love teaching Shakespeare in school. I loved it. And I think because I loved it, the kids loved it. And many of them will see me and remember lines that we studied together, you know, and recite them to me. I mean, that's wonderful. 40 years later, and I'm having students meet me on the street and say, I remember when you said, and repeat the line from Shakespeare. My gosh, it's wonderful. Okay, so teaching is such a rewarding job. Every single one of Shakespeare's tragedies has humor in it.
Of course. Even just a moment, even just one line.
Yeah, just one moment.
Yeah.
The most horrifying plays, Othello and Macbeth, they have moments of raucous humor. It's as though we have to go through a period in order to temper the terror, to really penetrate our heart. We have to temper it with humor. So.
I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why Shakespeare actually is truly a literary genius, because if you actually look at normal conversation between men and they're having a serious conversation, there will always be someone cracking a joke in a very serious conversation.
Absolutely.
Always. 100% of the time.
Always.
Yeah.
Always. Sometimes it's an off-color joke.
Quite frequently. Quite frequently. But it's important because that gets everyone like, okay, all right, we can take a breath. All right, like we're back at it again. You know? And it's I think it's somehow important, and I'm not exactly sure why.
Yeah, there's a psychological effect. And, there's been some study recently that laughter is a way of uniting a group. Mm-hmm. It takes the place in humans of what a grooming activity does with chimpanzees and bonobos. They groom one another to be close socially to one another so that there's that actual physical contact that breaks whatever barriers they have between themselves.
I try to groom my friends. They just don't
I know.
have it.
Yeah. They do not
Robert,
want to
you've
know
got to
what
stop
you think
combing
about.
my hair, Robert.
Right.
Stop it.
Never.
Right. And we are not going to check, Chris, on how they're hanging.
Not my job. I don't get paid enough for that.
Right. It's above my pay grade. Yeah, but you're right. And so humor, I think, I don't know. I don't know what the psychological dimensions of humor are. I only know that I observe that humor gets us through these times when otherwise we would be devastated and terrified and so sad. Humor lifts us. It lightens our hearts.
I mean, I find that the most somber, most awful moments, there's always some jerk telling a really terrible joke. And that's what makes it feel more real. It doesn't make it feel less real. It doesn't take me away from the moment. And actually is like, okay, we're all in this. We're all having this moment together. Like, and that's how bad it's become, is now we have to tell these kinds of jokes to, come on guys, we got to like get out of this and start moving on and emotionally getting over this.
Right.
Because it's, I'm sure you've been through a lot of very emotional, turbulent moments in your life. There's some moments where you really, really need to stop obsessing about how bad this moment is and move on.
Right.
And you can, some people don't. Some people go in this, this never-ending vortex where they just start drinking themselves to death or drugs or whatever.
Running from it. Yeah, they're running. They're running from it.
Yeah, different form of running.
Yeah, and you can run as hard as you want. You're not going to get away from it. The only thing you can do is laugh in its face.
And there's a lot of PTSD research about this. The faster you can come to terms with the actual realities of what happened, as opposed to running from them, as opposed to compartmentalizing them, and then having this emotional reaction to it, the better.
Right.
So the faster you can say, here's what happened, here's the details and the logical process of what happened. Okay, punctuated by a joke. Now we're past it. Now we're moving to the next topic. You're much less likely to have that intense, awful sensation.
Right.
Ongoing.
Right.
So you also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the corruption involved in the sort of, East Texas towns, or I think that would be worth mentioning and talking a little bit about. What sort of corruption were you implying?
Well, the thing about corruption of government officials is that it's universal. And we've certainly seen it in Washington, D.C., within living memory, shall we say. So it's not unusual to find it in other smaller communities. I'll tell you a story. Sure. Do you mind if I tell you a story?
I do not. This is your hour. You or multiple hours. You can do whatever you want.
I'm a brand new reporter in this little town, and I hear that the school board is going to have a meeting. And I figure, well, I ought to go cover the school board because they spend a lot of money and they're the biggest employer. And they do. They're the biggest employer in any town is the school board. True in Austin, by the way. So I go to the meeting. Well, and they're reading down the list of things that the board members have to vote on, and they've come to this little thing, and there's something about a car accident and how the superintendent's car was in a wreck, and then they just move on. And they get to the end of that little presentation, and they say, well, are there any questions? And I say, what is this car wreck? I mean, why do we have to buy the superintendent a new car? That's kind of an expensive wreck if we have to buy him a new car. And the board member says, and the superintendent's sitting there, and the board member says, oh, he was in orange, and he was at a stop sign. Somebody ran a stop sign and totaled his car. So, we have insurance, but we're going to have to pay to buy him a new car. I said, oh, okay. Why was he in orange? And the superintendent speaks up and he said, oh, I was negotiating some purchase of some athletic equipment for the school. I'm brand new at this. Mm-hmm. I'm willing to say, okay, yeah, sure, guys. And I said, oh, what kind of athletic equipment? And he says, oh, just stuff we needed for the athletic department, things like jock straps and weights for the weight room. And I said, oh. I said, and I'm sorry, and I said, well, did you buy some? He said, yeah, we made a deal. I said, yeah. I said, good. Did you get any bids on this stuff? I don't know why I thought to say that. And the superintendent said, well, we didn't need to get any bids because we know what it cost, and we felt like we were getting a really good deal on this particular sale. I said, okay, well, that's good. Good business practice to get, not legal probably, I didn't say that, but it's good business practice to get the best deal you can get. So we rock along. A month later, the car business has not died down. And a month after that, we realized that he had actually been in Orange. This is Orange, Texas. Mm-hmm. He'd actually been in Orange, Texas, visiting with the female representative of the sporting goods company, who had been coming to his office every week to visit with him.
He's a man about town.
Right. Mm-hmm. So then a couple of months pass, and there's a UIL contest. Now, for people who don't know, UIL stands for University Interscholastic League. And I don't know why they call it university, except it got started by the University of Texas, and the University of Texas doesn't have anything to do with it anymore, but it's still named the UIL. And it's a competition on various academic and athletic programs between public schools in Texas. And they're divided into categories of school, by the size of the school and so on. And there was a UIL contest, and this little town had sent teams here to Austin to compete in the UIL contest. Well, things like ready writing and poetry reading and prose reading and band and speech and not the general sports
Sure.
thing that most Texans would be interested in.
Not football.
Right. Wasn't football. Wasn't track. So he had taken off 4 days of school to go to attend the UIL conference. Well, you don't send students to a UIL conference unless they're accompanied by teachers as chaperones, because they're going to be spending the night away from home for a couple of nights, and you're still responsible for them. It's a school trip, and you're the adult in the room, and they're kids, and you can't ask them to be responsible for themselves if they're under the age of 18, even though they should be perfectly capable of being responsible for themselves. They still have to be supervised. Mm-hmm. Well, the teachers came back and said, well, we don't know where the superintendent was.
Okay.
Because he never showed up. So we started talking.
Is he in a sporting good store at any
Right.
point today?
Right. So we started talking, and it turns out that instead of coming to the UIL thing, taking 4 days off and coming to the UIL contest, he had taken 4 days off and gone to San Antonio, where he had checked into the Menger Hotel.
Mm-hmm. Buying more sporting goods.
He was buying more sporting goods. Right. It was sporting, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. And good.
Good enough. Gentlemen, if you're married, be aware of your wives and don't try to get away with stuff, because they will figure you out every time.
Eventually, yes.
Probably faster than you believe.
Yeah. Oh, that's always true. Like, I'll do one more time. Nope.
Probably faster than you believe. Mm-hmm. My wife called up the Menger Hotel, and she said, she talked to the desk, and she said, I just have to know. I mean, I have to know. Did so-and-so spend the night at your hotel on the nights of so-and-so and so-and-so? And the lady who answered the phone down there said, oh, honey, we can't tell you that. What was his name? Flip. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was here in room so-and-so for 4 nights. Was he alone? Well, it says 2 people.
Yep.
He left education and the last I heard, was selling tires in Texarkana.
Might have been happier with that job.
He was certainly under a lot less pressure.
Mm-hmm.
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 So, yeah. So that was, you talk about corruption. Corruption crops up everywhere in small towns, big towns. It's everywhere. People are people. And, one of the themes of the book is that it's not history that repeats. It's people who repeat. Mm-hmm. People are always the same. We learn the lessons of history, but we can't figure out people.
So you also talked about fear and how it might have played a role in how people interact with one another and how to use that. Is that the kind of fear you were talking about, where you kind of post up and you sort of, I'm going to beat you up, or is it a different type of fear? What do you?
I think there are all kinds of fear. Particularly in this book, I'm trying to deal with all kinds of fear. Certainly, the fear of nature is one of them. And the symbol of that is a rattlesnake I call Old Coil, and this is actually a true story. A rattlesnake lived in the basement of the courthouse.
No one thought to remove it?
Well, it's...
That's an odd pet, I would say. It's not like a dog that you feed out the back.
It was an actual rattlesnake, and I commented that it was the only rattlesnake in the courthouse, unlikely to be reelected, not standing for reelection. And he was killed by one of the deputies.
Eventually,
there was a group of domino players out on the courthouse lawn, and in spring had come, and this 6 or 8 foot long rattlesnake comes up out of the basement, starts slithering across the grass, gets close to the domino players, and they look over and freak out and go screaming. And the sheriff's office hears them screaming out there, and the 80-year-old men don't generally jump up and down and scream. Mm-hmm. And the sheriff's office, which is right up, an open window away, mm-hmm. no air conditioning, of course. They send a deputy down, and the deputy sees a snake, follows it across the street, and pulls out his revolver and kills it on the sidewalk. Takes several shots to get it.
Of course,
right?
yeah.
And bam, 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 bam. And
no animal control in town. No.
And the broken concrete in the sidewalk where he shot where the bullets hit is still there. And if you know the history of that story, it's interesting sometimes to walk that sidewalk and see where 40 years ago somebody,
or old coil.
Yeah, right. Old coil, right? Yeah. So if there was one, there was probably more than one. Mm-hmm. And I think that might have been the reason there were so few rats in the courthouse, mm-hmm. except those in elected office.
Sure.
And so anyway, I use old coil, name him old coil, and I use him as as a metaphor for the danger of nature itself, which can be fatal and will sneak up on you, mm-hmm. No matter how attentive.
Eventually, we all get taken up by nature. So.
Right. Well, John,
one form or another.
Yeah, John McPhee points out nature has time on her side. Mm-hmm. We don't. Mm-hmm. So nature always wins.
Yeah.
Yep. So that's one form of fear. Another form of fear is physical violence from other people. Mm-hmm. Another form of fear is fear that is promoted by racial hatred. Another form of fear, and this is in the book, another form of fear is economic fear that is caused by some people trying to take stuff from other people, literally stealing their welfare, their property, or whatever. That's in the book.
The fear you mentioned about being arrested unfairly, or
yes, right.
That's a bad issue.
Particularly now. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, we have one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, maybe even the highest in the United States. And so it's always in the back of my head, well, all it really takes is someone deciding that right. they're going to make this your problem and pin mm-hmm. this thing on you or rightfully believe that it's you, even though it's not you for whatever reason.
Right.
And so, yeah, that is a threat I think every American kind of has to have in their back of their head to some degree. What would you do? What would you do if the cops came to your door and like, hey, we know you committed this heinous crime across the street. You're the only one who was there at the time. And
I'd say you got a warrant.
Yeah, I know, but
go away when you have a warrant. Come back when you have a warrant.
But they might is the problem.
Well, they might.
And they might, and
then I hire a lawyer and I keep my mouth shut.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't say, well, I don't know why that gun was loaded on the set at Rust.
You already said you have a gun, sir. Yeah. We have it on the Arsnake Show.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you never succeed in participating in your own investigation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You just have to let the pros do the investigating, and you have to find somebody who can represent you.
Which is really terrifying because I know a lot of investigators who are not very good.
Right. Right. And it can be so expensive to defend yourself. I'll tell you another story. Are you ready for another story?
I am. It's about that time.
Yeah. Okay. So we had a fellow living out there in the country. He had some cows, and he had he had a fenced pasture, and in his back, which constituted his backyard. Well, he had a swing set out there in the backyard, and his kids would go out and swing on the swings, and young kids, and they had a good time and doing that. And he had these prize cattle, not very many of them, 4 or 5, maybe 6 calves that he was hoping to raise, and he wanted to raise his kids in the 4-H program and help them understand how to grow cattle and make beautiful cattle, and that's a noble ambition.
Honest profession.
Honest profession, and we need people who do that and who understand how it's done. Well, he was home from work one day, and he saw a dog, heard a loud commotion in the backyard, and saw a dog biting one of his prize calves. So he grabbed his .30-30 rifle and he ran to the back porch and he shot the dog, which is what I would do. The dog belonged to one of his neighbors who claimed that it was worth more than $750. And that by shooting it, he had stolen his dog from him, which was a felony. So he filed a criminal charge on the man for shooting the dog in his own backyard, attacking his own cow. The district attorney knew the guy who owned the dog, and he liked the guy who owned the dog. So he took it to the grand jury, and he explained. His dog was easily worth $750. Might have been worth 10 times that. And the grand jury said, well, it is a felony that we're charging this man with. And the district attorney said, and I'm just making this up because nobody knows what goes on in front of in a grand jury. Nobody knows for sure. And at any rate, they true building. He got charged with a felony for killing the dog that was attacking his calf in his backyard next to his swing set. Okay? Where his kids had been playing earlier that day. And it went to trial. And all the evidence was presented. And the jury recessed to consider a verdict. And they were out of the jury room in 5 minutes with a not guilty decision.
That's lucky. It could have gone the other way.
It could have gone the other way. And
They
they
could
wrote,
have.
but they presented to the court as part of their verdict a written statement signed by every person in the jury that this was the most worthless piece of criminal jury work, trial, most worthless criminal trial anybody had ever heard of, and there's no reason why these charges should have been brought for something like this. Yay for the jury.
Yeah, that's
sometimes,
rare.
yeah,
That's
sometimes,
rare. They
sometimes
don't usually do that.
Sometimes it goes that way, sometimes, and that's a true story. So the problem with being a reporter in a small town such as the Whitmire, Texas, which is the fictional town in this book, is that you remember all of those stories, and they jumble in your head. They never go away. The day the guy threw the redbud logs off a redbud tree into his fireplace because he thought they would burn, and he didn't have any other firewood, and then it turns out they were full of palmetto bugs, those big roach-looking things that are 2 inches long. And thousands of them came swarming out in his living room, and his wife goes screaming out the house, trying to get them out of her hair. And and that really happened.
And were they on fire as well?
No, what they were asleep because it was cold outside. And when he brought them in, the fire warmed them up, and they came to life and decided it was time to migrate because they didn't like fire. And so she suddenly had thousands of these bugs flying around in the air. And I know that happened because it was just 3 doors down from where I lived. I knew the guy, right?
Yeah,
I know. And you have thousands and thousands and thousands of stories like that. They just crop up over and over and over. Some are funny, some are not so funny. Some have to do with corruption. There was, it's not just money that will corrupt people. It's also the sense of power. And deputies sometimes, some of them are not the smartest. They're not the sharpest knives in the drawer, as they say. They may be playing with less than 52 cards in their deck. And they will abuse the power of their office in order to make quick work of getting somebody charged with a crime. So they beat them with a rubber hose until they confess. Well,
literally beat them?
Literally.
Wow.
Beat them with a rubber hose until they confess. So then they have a spoken confession. They take him in, they charge him, they put him in jail. He comes to trial. And his defense attorney says, well, now, and can you tell us the circumstances of your arrest? Well, I was, and did you confess to this crime? Yes, I did. And did anybody force you to confess this crime? Yeah, well, that guy right over there. And how did he do that? Well, he beat me with a rubber hose for about 20 minutes.
Is that guy still alive? That seems like a fast way to get yourself killed by the police.
And the judge goes, mistrial.
Wow.
And turns to the district attorney and says, meet me in chambers.
Wow.
But yes, corruption
lucky. That's lucky because
creeps in. Yeah, again,
because the judge could have not believed him. He could have ended up in a jail situation where that cop says this guy needs to go because he might start squealing about something that is verifiable.
Right. He might not have survived his first night in jail. In
right.
other words.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh,
crazy.
Yeah.
So you have another story coming up, the Lie Detector App. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, that was a fun book. It's done.
You finished it. Okay,
I finished.
It's just not out yet.
It's not out yet.
Still editing process.
Well, yes, and it needs to be updated a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a novel actually that explores the boundary between reality and digital gaming. Because I think when you're 14, maybe sometimes reality and the world of your digital games gets confused, and you start seeing the real world in terms of the games that you're playing, and vice versa. So that's the kind of world I create in that book. I think it's a fun story. It's not brutal, in the way that this one is. And certainly not based on actual events. But I just had this idea, these phones that we have now are so powerful. The cameras can read all kinds of stuff. We programmed them to record visible light, but they're seeing a wide spectrum of light, infrared and ultraviolet, which is way beyond the capacity of the human eye to see. Your iPhone can see it. And there may be ways in which, when you're talking, you are actually revealing your most innermost self. What you really believe versus what you're saying may be revealed through the way your face projects light in invisible spectrum.
That is possible, and also micro expressions. But there's also other things, like, for instance, your phone's vibration sensors, its three-dimensional axis control,
right,
is so sensitive it can actually pick up voice. So
yes.
Even if your phone is off, the microphone's off, if you have an app that has access to the calibration sensor to know which dimension it's pointing or whatever for your compass app or whatever, it could theoretically hear your conversation and know what's going on around you.
Right,
so,
and even broadcast it.
Yeah, there's a lot of little things like that. In aggregate, they tell a pretty good picture. Pretty detailed picture.
Right. So it's the Lie Detector app. The kid writes an app for his smartphone that ends up being able to tell whether somebody is telling a lie or not in the process of telling it. And yes, micro expressions. Narrowing of the pupil and poker players do it. They make a living.
Yeah.
Reading other players.
Absolutely.
Sometimes they don't know these people. Yeah,
I've actually talked with one of the best human lie detectors in the world. The guy Lie to Me, that show.
Yes.
It's based on a real person.
Yes, right.
I actually talked to him. And there's a lot of both real science behind it and also like a lot of kind of tangential or more like statistical analysis. Like these 50 things have to be true for the one thing to be true. And you can't rely on any one of the signals. You kind of have to take them in aggregate. It's really interesting kind of. It's halfway between science and not science because it's just not been measured enough yet.
Right. You can't verify it with our numbers yet.
Yeah, I'll have to get you in touch with this guy. It's very interesting.
Yeah, that's fun. One of them actually, when somebody asked me, well, how did you celebrate finishing your book? And I said, well, I celebrated by starting another book. And I did, and it's going to be set in the same town, and it has.
It's literally the same town.
Yeah, and
how fun.
Some of the same people, some of the same.
That's good.
Some
Recurring
of the same
themes.
Yes, right, and this one is going to be about the hero is a single mother, and she works for a bank, and she uncovers an embezzlement, and life goes kind of haywire for everybody involved.
Mm-hmm.
And she figures out how to rescue it.
Did you know you were going to write that when you were writing this? Have
No.
you? Okay. All right. So follow-up question. Do you know that you're going to write another book? Are you weaving in characters from this book into a future book?
From the one that I'm writing now?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Okay, good.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's how you have to do it,
Yeah.
right? And you're like,
Yeah,
ooh, there's this hint.
When you
back in
create
here.
these hundreds of people, and they're, to me, they're as real as you are,
Sure.
right?
Because you've made them up and you know everything about them.
Right. One of the
I feel a TV series in the making.
Boy, I hope so. That'd be fun.
That'd be fun.
Well, one of the things I do when I'm writing a book is I go scanning through the internet, looking at pictures of people, and I'll find a picture of somebody and say, oh, that person is such and such a character. That face matches that character. So I'll capture that image and I'll put it up on my little clipboard, and so when I'm writing about that person, I can look at that picture. One of the more entertaining characters in this book is named Daryl Stewart, and the face that most represents what, in my mind, he looks like. I found at the Crystal Bridges Museum in Hope, Arkansas. Is it Hope? Is that the name of it? Anyway, Arkansas. Crystal Bridges Museum. And it was a painting of a 19th century Indian, but he had exactly the right expression, Mm-hmm. And the Indian, Outtro Indian. I think the tribe has disappeared now. I don't think they can even be found anymore. But
You got to get these photos and somehow incorporate them, or get some artist to go through and
right, right, and then and I'll pull up somebody else. And
it'll make casting much easier when the TV show comes out.
Well, right. Yeah. Okay, find a girl who looks like this. Find a guy who looks like this. Yeah.
You find a Toei Indian who's like, come on, man.
But now you work.
You're gonna have to help me out a little.
You work with Cameron long enough to know that casting is not something that the author ends up having much choice about.
Yeah, that's true. Although it does help to have a sense of it. Yeah. Okay, so you can find this on Amazon or anywhere else?
That's correct. Yes, and you can order it through any bookstore.
Okay.
It's available in paperback and hardback.
And you have a website or social media?
JohnYearwood.com.
Okay.
And I'm also on Facebook and LinkedIn and
great,
and Instagram and
Twitter. The Lie Detector app. When is that expected, do you think? I know it's hard to tell because
let me tell you, the Lie Detector app is my ace in the hole. I'm holding on to that in case suddenly a publisher says, "Yearwood, this is great. Give us another novel like tomorrow," and I can go, "Sure."
Here it is.
Bam, I'll work all night. I'll edit the shit out of it. Sorry, Chris, you got to cut that word.
No, it's all fair game. You can say whatever you want. I should have told you that 2 hours ago.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'll edit the stuff out that needs to be edited out and send it off, and it'll be fine. And I'll have another book, and that one really would make a dynamite movie. That would make a dynamite movie because of the mixture between reality and fantasy. The digital fantasy, the game world, and the real world.
So when do you think it will come out if you don't get that crazy call? If it doesn't
I don't know. Well, it may come out next because the one I'm writing now, which is the follow-up to this, I may end up putting that one in the bottom drawer and taking this one out and saying, okay, let's see how this goes. And
all right.
So, yeah, and then I have 2 more that I'm working on.
Can you give us a hint?
Well, one's science fiction, and it involves colonization on Mars.
Same universe? Do we?
It's not the same people. No, it's completely different.
You can't draw lineage, their great grandchildren or anything.
No, not gonna do that.
Okay, all right.
And another one, also set in the future, is a world in which capitalism has finally reached its culmination.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, what do you think capitalism looks like when there's no longer capitalism?
I don't know what that means.
How does capitalism succeed? How does it succeed? Because
I was actually talking to somebody about this just the other day. I forget who it was, but they were talking about like, what does the end game? Everyone knows what communism turns into at the absolute extremes, but we have never seen capitalism turn into its absolute extreme, and we're trying to like figure out what that would actually look like, and it's really just a bunch of monopolies. And like, But I just don't think that would work. It would kind of fall over.
It's only a bunch of it's only a bunch of monopolies until somebody starts accumulating the monopolies.
Yeah.
And then it ends up with a small group of oligarchs running the entire
Which could
planet.
actually end up happening kind of inadvertently with people who own robotics, for instance, or
Yes.
own AI, or own some of these massive kind of future entertainment as a whole thing. If you could,
Right.
if you could turn
Right.
entertainment into a technology and own it,
Right.
there's a way
Right.
that you could own,
Right.
and then you might have one or two or three companies on Earth.
Right. Right. And one of the driving factors in that book that right now I'm not working on it, but I will. One of the driving factors is that people confuse capitalism with morality, and it's not. Capitalism is not a moral system. It's an economic system. Morality is different.
Mm-hmm.
You choose what is the best behavior based on what is most right to do for the people who are involved.
Mm-hmm.
You don't choose it because you make the most money out of it. And the state of Texas writes into its curriculum that we are forced to teach the benefits of a free trade system, right? We are required. They require public schools to teach not the question, not the examination, not whether free trade is good, but required to teach the benefits of a free trade system, which we do not live in. We don't live in free trade, because free trade without government control,
There's monopolies. That's what you end up with.
it's piracy. Think about it.
That's true, because you don't have the idea of patents.
Right.
So you end up with a lot of pirates. That's good.
Or property rights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. John, we could probably talk about that for an hour.
We could, I'm sure.
I like that. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you, sir.
It was actually a real pleasure. I didn't think we'd go through all of this. So that's been really great. Thank you so
good.
much.
Yeah. I hope you get something
Oh,
that you like.
we got a
Yeah.
lot. Yeah,
Good.
absolutely. Thank you so
Good.
much.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Thank you. Bye-bye.